Today we are going to start with the rest of the arguments that Northrop Frye has initiated about how myths are becoming part of our literary criticism. What we discussed in the last lecture, that Frye is claiming that the myth is central informing power that gives archetypal significance to the ritual and archetypal narrative to the oracle. And that's why the myth is the archetype. And he even say that it might be convenient to say myth only when referring to narrative and archetype when speaking of significance. Then he mentioned about the solar cycle, the four different things that he discussed, and said that in solar cycle of day, the seasonal cycle of year, the organic cycle of human life, there is a single pattern of significance out of which myth constructs a central narrative around a figure which is partly the sun, partly vegetative fertility, and partly God or archetypal human being. And he mentioned that he is trying to give it a systematic approach, as the very famous book of Fraser, The Golden Bow, as it has given a systematic approach to understand myth and archetypes. Frye has given a tabulated form of the myths, how those archetypes are. So, as we have seen, he has given the different ideas about the day, the solar cycle of the day, the seasonal cycle of the year, the organic cycle of human life. He has given a single pattern and how it is related with literature. He has explained it in a tabulated form in different phases. Now, if you divide the solar cycle of a day, it is going to be divided into four different types. First is dawn, that before the sun rises and the sun comes up in the morning, that is called as dawn, DAWN. Then the zenith, when the sun is at the top. Then there is sunset, and there is darkness. These are the four different steps of a solar cycle of a day. Now he has made, according to that solar cycle of a day, solar cycle of a year, he has given a complete tabulated form of archetypes and myths that have been developed, how archetypes are coming out of all those things. The first, he said, the dawn, DAWN. What is the solar year? That is spring, and birth phase. That is the thing he's selling. And what is the myth of these things? The myths of birth of hero, of revival, and of resurrection, of creation. Because the four phases are a cycle. And that's why he is saying that this is how the cycle begins. The dawn, this is the solar day. Then the seasonal cycle of year, what would be the seasonal cycle of the year? It may be spring. So when it is spring, it shows new birth. In the season of spring, you find out new birth is taking place. New leaves are coming to the trees. Everything is coming into the season of spring. New life is getting. That's why it is called as a birth phase. So, what are the common myths of this particular season? Birth of hero, of revival, of resurrection, and of creation. Because these are the four cycles. Then the myth of defeat of power of darkness. Because it is dawn, the darkness is defeated, and that's why the new day is coming up. Defeat of power of darkness, winter, because after winter there is spring. In winter, all the leaves are getting down, and new leaves are coming in the season of spring. So it is defeating winter, it is defeating the death. Now, what are the, if hero is the main character of this season, then who is going to be the subordinate character, father and mother? And what type of archetype it is going to develop? It is going to develop the archetype of romance, where most dithyrambic and rhapsodic poetry will come into existence. This is the first phase. I'll repeat it once again so that it will be easy for you to understand. As we have seen, what Fry said, Fry said that myth is the central informing power. And this central informing power is giving certain archetypal significance to ritual and archetypal narrative to oracle. For that, he has divided this into different phases in the solar cycle of day, seasonal cycle of year, organic cycle of human life. He said there are some pattern of significance out of which certain myths are constructed. Because of this pattern, certain myths are constructed. And those myths are carrying certain central figures. And central figures who are partly related with sun, sun, they are partly vegetative fertility and partly a god or archetypal human being. This type of things is been created. For that, he has made a tabulated form. He has given a table of its phases. What are the phases he is talking about? He says the dawn, the first phase, the first phase of solar day. It's dawn, DAWN. What would be the seasonal cycle? It is spring. Spring means birth phase. What are the myths? Myths that birth of hero, of revival, of resurrection, of creation, and of defeat of power of darkness. What are the power of darkness? Winter and death. What are the human characters, subordinate characters? They are father and mother. And what is the archetype? The archetype is romance and most of dithyrambic and rhapsodic poetry. This is the first phase he is talking of. The second phase. The second phase is zenith. The sun is at the top. You can say it's noon. It's noon, zenith at the top. This is the solar day. What is the seasonal cycle? It is summer. It is summer. And what is summer means by? Summer, because when you talk about dawn, it is spring and birth phase. Summer means the day is mature one. The thing is matured one. It reached to its certain level. It reaches to certain status. That's why it carries a phase of marriage or triumph phase. What are the myths related with it? Myths of apotheosis. Now, if you want to know what exactly it means by myth of apotheosis, you need to little bit go back to Greek uh, history, Greek literature that is talking about uh, the myth. And this myth of apotheosis is actually a Greek site, and it is saying that it is giving a glorification of a subject to a divine level. That means a man is reaching to godlike status. Because of his work, he is reaching to a godlike status that is called as myth of apotheosis. Man is reaching to the godlike status. That is myth of apotheosis. So what is the second type? That it is triumph or fifth marriage phase or triumph phase. Myths of apotheosis, that man is reaching to status of God. The sacred marriage, myths of sacred marriage, myths of entering into the paradise. These are the myths that are developed around this seasonal cycle, around this solar day. What are the subordinate characters in these myths? The companion and the bride. That is the subordinate character. And what is the archetype? The archetype is of comedy, pastoral, and idyll. These are the archetypes he is talking of. Now, the third phase is the sunset. This is the solar day. What this sunset means by in seasonal cycle, it is autumn. Autumn means death phase. Spring is birth phase. Summer is marriage or triumph phase. Sunset is autumn and death phase. What are the myths that are revolved around this? Myths of fall, myths of dying God, myths of violent death and sacrifice and isolation of the hero. What are the subordinate characters for this myth? The siren or the traitors. These are the subordinate characters for this myth. And what is the archetype? The archetype of tragedy and elegy. These are the archetypes of this third phase. The fourth phase is naturally of darkness, winter, and dissolution phase. Winter and dissolution phase. What are the myths survived around? Myths of triumph of these powers, myths of triumphs of darkness, myths of flood and return of chaos, of defeat of the hero. These are the myths, different myths. What are the subordinate characters? The ogre, the witch. These are the subordinate characters of this darkness. And what is the archetype? The archetype is of satire. So these are the four different phases that Northrop Frye is talking about. Now, if you see very carefully, my friends, why he is talking about all those things, if you remember our earlier lecture, a lecture that we took on Thursday, in that lecture we used to say that myth is a central informing power which used to create a sort of archetypes that gives archetypes significance to certain rituals. Now these are the rituals that we are talking. This has received an archetypal significance. Romance, comedy, pastoral, idyll, tragedy, elegy, satire, all these things received archetypal significance. Why? Because myth has given this archetypal significance. Archetypal narrative is for oracles. So myth has given. So what sort of myth? He talks about the first solar day, that how the solar day, what its symbol, what it talks about, what sort of myths are developed. Because these myths are giving some sort of informing power. And the myth is the archetype. And that's why it is what he is saying, that when it is convenient to say that myth only referring to narrative and archetype when speaking of significance. That's why he has given this tabulated form for the four different phases. I'll repeat once again those four different phases. The dawn. What is the phase? It is spring and birth phase. If you look into the seasonal cycle, it is spring, and if you look to the human cycle, it is birth phase. What are the myths survived? What are the myths that inform? Myths of birth of the hero, myths of revival and resurrection, myths of creation and of defeat of the powers of darkness, that is winter and death. How this narrative is built up, how this narrative is coming out. Narrative is coming with these subordinate characters are father and mother. And what sort of archetype it has given, what sort of archetype it has given, a significance archetype is of romance and of dithyrambic and rhapsodic poetry. This is the first phase. The second phase is the zenith. What is the seasonal cycle? Summer. What is the human phase? It is marriage or triumph phase. What are the myths? Myths of apotheosis. What is apotheosis? Apotheosis is giving a status of godlike to a human being because of his achievement. Myths of apotheosis. Myths of sacred marriage. Myths of entering into paradise, because it is what said in Christianity, that it is said in a Abrahamic religion that Adam and Eve living in paradise because they ate the knowledge of fruit of knowledge, they have been thrown out of the paradise. So it is the ultimate objective of human life is to achieve that paradise which they are thrown off. So the second phase is saying that it is entering into the paradise. What are the subordinate characters? The subordinate characters are the companion and the bride. And what is the archetype? The archetype of comedy, pastoral, idyll. The third phase, the third phase is the sunset. What is the seasonal cycle? It is autumn. What is the human cycle? It is death phase. What are the myths? Myths of fall, myths of dying God, myths of violent death, myths of sacrifice, myths of isolation of the hero. What are the subordinate characters for all those things? The subordinate characters are the traitor, the siren. And what is the archetype? The archetype of tragedy and elegy. These are the archetypes. The fourth phase is the darkness. What is the seasonal phase? Is winter. What is the human phase? It is dissolution phase. What are the myths? Myths of the triumph of these powers, myths of floods and return of chaos, myths of defeat of the hero. All these are the myths. What are the subordinate characters? The ogre and the witch. These are the subordinate characters. What are the archetype? The archetype is of satire. So these are the four different phases that Northrop Frye has given about when he's talking about the myth and archetypes. Now the quest, after discussing about these four different phases, Frye is discussing that the quest of hero also tends to assimilate the oracular and the random verbal structure. That is the quest of the hero, that he is trying to bring out the two things together. There are certain oral tales, oral stories that are transferred from one generation to another generation. So there is oracular, and there are certain random verbal structures when he is talking about, when he's trying to get all those things, when he's trying to mix both the things together. That is the quest of hero. And as we can see, when we watch that, the chaos of local legends that results from the prophetic epiphanies, that certain prophetic epiphanies, discovering, illuminating discoveries that are coming out of these prophecies. And because of that, the local hero is getting in a chaotic phase. We have seen all those things, we have watched it in literature. And this is consolidating into a typical sort of narrative. It is consolidating into a mythology, that because of the prophetic epiphanies, the local legend hero is in chaos, and this is converting into mythology because he is unable to resolve it. He is unable to solve this, and that's why a mythology is developed. Mythology of whom? Mythology of departmental gods, mythology of different gods. And that's why you will find out, my friends, in Greek mythology, there are different references to different gods, different references to different gods. Even in Indian mythology, if you see very carefully, there are so many references to so many gods. There is no one god who is talking about all those things. And in most of the higher religions, this this sort of phase of the hero is becoming the central quest. Myths that emerges from rituals. Certain myths are emerging from rituals in higher religions. As you will find out, the Messiah myth. Messiah myth is the myth that is part of the Abrahamic tradition. Who will rule? Who will rule the religion? The line of King David will rule the religion. This is the Messiah myth that the Jewish used to follow this myth. And that's why later on you will find out in state, God is the representative of the king. This is the myth that gives birth to this idea. And that's why in most of the higher religions, this in turn has become the same central quest. The quest that the hero is trying to assimilate the oracle and random verbal structure, trying to create a sort of narrative mythology. Narrative mythology is constructed because of the chaos that a local leader, local legend who resulted from the epiphanic prophecies. This is consolidating into the narrative mythology of the departmental gods. And that's why he is mentioning it, that how these religions have developed their own rituals and myths. Rituals of myths that emerges out of the rituals. As Messiah myth, which became a narrative structures of the oracle of Judaism. If you look at the Judaism, every oracle is carrying this Messiah myth into it, that whatever the king is going to say, that is to be followed because he is a representative of the god. This is the Messiah myth. And every oracle of Judaism is following this narrative structure. Fry gives a very simple example of flood. What is the example that he gives of a flood? A local flood, a flood that usually used to happen around us most of the time. A local flood that your river, a local river is getting a flood at that time. The local flood may get a folktale by accident. A local flood may beget a folktale by accident. But a comparison of flood stories, a comparison of flood stories will show that how quickly such tales become examples of myth of dissolution, how these tales later on be converted into a myth. A normal flood beget a folk tale by accident, and that's what it is getting a comparison with the flood stories. And these flood stories, along with this local flood, is getting a structure of myth. It is becoming a myth of dissolution. And that's why Fry says that the tendency of both rituals and epiphany, it becomes encyclopedic. It becomes part of a book, a part of life, and is realized in a definitive body of myth. It is realized in certain definitive body of myth which constitutes the sacred scriptures of a religion. How these sacred scriptures of religions are coming? It is a encyclopedic structure of rituals and epiphany. The myths are giving, coming out of it, the myths are giving a definitive body of myth. It is giving a definitive body of myth. These rituals and epiphanies, they are coming together and they are giving a definitive body of myth. And this definitive body of myth constitutes a sacred scriptures of religions. Now, this sacred scriptures, what Fry says, these sacred scriptures are consequently the first documents that the literary critique has to study to gain a comprehensive view of his subject. For getting a comprehensive view of his subject, the literary critic has to study, has to know, has to get familiar with this sacred scriptures. Sacred scriptures. Sacred scriptures are coming out of the rituals and epiphany, which become encyclopedic and is realized in the definitive body of myth, which consequently constitutes a sacred scriptures of religion. So a literary critique need to read, need to understand the sacred scriptures first of all, before trying to enter into the field of criticism. After he has understood this, their structure, the structure of the sacred scriptures, he can later on descend from archetypes to genres. Because what type of archetypes? Archetype of romance, archetype of comedy, archetype of pastoral, archetype of idyll, archetype of tragedy, elegy, or satire. All these are the different archetypes. These archetypes, once he understood the structure of sacred scriptures, then he can descend from archetypes, because myths has an informing power about the significance of archetypes. And that's why he said in the table, in the tabulated form, the four phases that he discussed, he has pointed out about the myths and about the archetypes, what sort of archetypes these myths are carrying with it. So he, once able to understand the structure of sacred scriptures, then he can able to descend himself to the archetypes, and from archetypes to genres, and then he can able to see that how drama emerges from ritual side of myth, how drama is coming from the rituals, as we have seen last semester that when we are discussing about drama, saying that drama is part of rituals. So then the critic can able to understand about drama, that how drama emerges out of rituals, what are the ritual side of myth, and lyric from the epiphanic or fragmented side. Well, epic carries on the central encyclopedic structure. This is what Fry has divided. This is how Fry has said that once the literary critique is able to understand the structure of sacred scriptures, he can able to move to archetypes, from archetype to genres, and from genres he can able to find out what sort of different myths are being formulated, how myths are giving birth to different kinds of literary work. If a critic wants to work on criticism, he should know that what is the genesis of that particular literary genre. But when telling about this in-depth, serious understanding, understanding of myth, serious understanding of archetypes, he cautioned about certain things. He cautioned that there are some words of caution he has given. And he said some words of caution and encouragements are necessary before literary criticism has clearly staked out, clearly worked out what are its boundaries. When it is creating its boundaries, literary criticism, when it is formulating, when it is making its own framework, this literary criticism has to understand certain restrictions, has to know about its own limitations. If you don't know your limitations, you are not able to understand what you are going to do. And that's why he says it is the part of critics' business that to show how all literary genres are derived from quest myth. How these all literary genres are derived from the quest. What is the quest? Quest of myth. But the derivation is logical one. That when he's reaching to this derivation, it should be logical one within the science of criticism. Because we treat criticism as a science, so within the science of criticism, you need to understand, you need to point out, you need to know that what are the derivation. And that's why he says that the quest myth will constitute the first chapter of the future handbooks of criticism. Quest book should be, quest myth should be the first chapter of handbooks of criticism. Maybe written that will based on organized critical knowledge. You can call it as introduction or outline. You live up to any sort of title, but it should have chapter, the first chapter of quest myth, which is giving introduction, which is giving outline of what sort of criticism you are going to find out. Why myth? Why he is insisting so much on myth? Because myth is an increasing power of significance of archetypes. Archetypes are giving idea about genres. And once you know the genre, you know the structure of it. Once you know the structure of it, it will be easy for you to have scientific understanding of criticism. Fry furthermore says that it is only when we try to expound the derivation chronologically, if you are expanding this derivation, once you derived it, once you found it, that it's a logical understanding of yours, you make a derivation of how you are going to make it the whole criticism, how you are going to maintain the whole criticism, you have a certain derivation, and derivation is of having logical one. It is not illogical derivation, logical derivation. But there may be certain doubts in the minds of most of you. What exactly it means by derivation, sir? How are we going to find out the derivation in these cases? How are we going to talk about derivations? Derivation is the thing which require to have some sort of hypothesis to be formulated, and this hypothesis is to be tested. And once the hypothesis is tested, you require to have a logical testing of this hypothesis. Scientific steps for this understanding of hypothesis. Another simple example to understand. When you solve a problems in algebra when you were in school, you don't know certain figure, so use instead of that figure x, and later on you find out what exactly the figure is. You have a logical understanding of all those things. So you develop a derivation. And that's why he's saying that once you develop a derivation, you have to expound the derivation chronologically. And when you expound this derivation chronologically, we find ourselves writing with certain pseudo prehistorical fictions, rituals, folktales, myth, because you have to. Because what sort of myth, what sort of rituals, what sort of folktales are related? Prehistorical fictions and theories of mythological contract. You have to go step by step to write the criticism. You cannot write criticism immediately haphazardly. Again, here, Fry is cautioning most of the critics that if you're trying to use psychology and anthropology as your tool to reach to criticism, you need to understand that psychology and anthropology are the most highly developed sciences. Psychology and anthropology are the highly developed sciences. And the critic who deals with this kind of material, who is using psychology and anthropology as his material, he is bound to appear for some time. His his dilantate, his dilantate as from his subject. Dilettante means the one who is not having sufficient knowledge. Is not having sufficient knowledge of the subject. So if you are using this, you are bound to appear a dilettante. Dilettante of those subjects. So these two phases of criticism. One is you have to understand the archetypes and find out the genres, and to move further derivational to logical understanding of that. And the second one is you are using taking support of the highly developed sciences like psychology and anthropology and trying to find out the way to write down the criticism. These two phases of criticism, Fry says, are largely undeveloped in comparison with literary history and rhetorics. If you compare literary history and rhetorics, these types of criticism is undeveloped. The reason being the latter development of the sciences are related to, because you know it that latter sciences, the sciences have developed so much later on with their experiments and logical understanding, those sciences have been developed. The sort of fascination we received for myth or for psychology after knowing the books of Fraser's The Golden Bough and Jung's book on libido symbols, we get fascinated for these subjects. And these books have, for literary critics, is not based on dilettantism, but on the fact that these books are primary studies in literary criticism and very important ones. If you want to move further in criticism, you need to study these two books, he's saying. One is James Fraser's The Golden Bough, and the second Jung's book, that is book on libido symbols, written in Germany, translated in English with the title Psychology of the Unconscious, Symbols of Transformation. These two books are essential. These two books are compulsory that we can able to have all those things to understand. This is how Fry is trying to build up. This is how Fry is trying to create a sort of criticism, because criticism is a science, and this is how you can develop a science out of this criticism. So we will stop here because it is a very complicated one, heavy topic that I talked with you. We'll continue it in tomorrow's lecture, my friends.